Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
Because none but ourselves can free our minds.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome to Land of the Giants, and today we're going to talk about Les Miserables, and I'm so excited to talk about this. And the other day I watched the musical just to review, and I
Hmm.
read some of the Spark Notes, and I feel like while I was writing my notes, I was still part of the Victor Hugo cult as I was writing them. I still hadn't quite escaped from the Victor Hugo cult, and so I would say that Victor Hugo's Les Miserables definitely recommended.
I
and
agree.
and this book is it really is like the perfect cult book, or I should say treacherous book. It's like the perfect example of a treacherous book, like the kind of thing we like to talk about, because I honestly think that Victor Hugo was kind of a narcissist, and the ultimate purpose of the book is to convince you that Victor Hugo is the greatest novelist in history. And he kind of has this way of writing that it just seems like he is trying to maximize tear jerkers to me. Like he is trying to just arrange everything to just maximize pulling at your heartstrings, and regardless of whether it even makes sense. Because there are a few things I think about this book where if you think about it, it's kind of like, wait a minute, now why did that happen? And part of me really thinks that Victor Hugo was so busy like trying to be the greatest novelist in history that he just didn't think about some things. And
Right.
well, let me just quickly give my thoughts on the musical, and then I'll let you continue. And the musical is kind of like what struck me about the musical is that it is incredibly dumbed down, and yet manages to be an amazing reproduction of the book, and it is extremely faithful to the book. But it kept reminding me of the movie Idiocracy, so it's kind of like the musical is like the Idiocracy version of the book. And I am of two minds about this. And part of me is thinking like that this shows you the fact that you can dumb down the story so much. It shows you how much Victor Hugo just relies on kind of like dumb tricks to keep you reading. But on the other hand, like the fact that the story can be presented in this way, and it's almost kind of like a Disney movie, like a very long Disney movie. And I was absolutely entranced by the musical when I was a little kid. And to me, it also kind of takes on the character of a mythology. And that's kind of a characteristic of mythology, is that you can present it to children and they get it.
Right.
Um, and another comparison I want to make really quick is to the Mahabharata. And you could really imagine like a whole society that uses Les Miserables as kind of like their model for how people should be. So I think Les Miserables is kind of like the Mahabharata. And just a couple more comparisons. We talked about Sade before, and so I think Les Miserables is almost kind of like the inverse of Juliet, because in Juliet you always are identifying with the evil characters who are doing the humiliating, and in Les Miserables you always have to identify with the characters who are being humiliated. Um, and Also, there's a comparison to Ayn Rand, because we know that she used Victor Hugo as a model, and her style of writing is quite similar to his.
Yes, I agree. So there's a great deal in there. I think that a place to start is to observe that Hugo himself pointed out his anti-Sade kind of perspective, right? That the very explicitly the novel is a tale that's to take the reader from injustice to justice, from evil to good, from depravity to humanity. So I think there's no question he had an explicit framework that was supposed to move the writer in that direction. And yes, very much like Rand or like any of the Western canon that involves narrative framework as a vehicle for all kinds of other discursive forms. Yeah, there's a pedigree, and I would say that Hugo does it par excellence. I mean, I think that your point about Hugo wanting to have been seen to be the greatest novelist of all time, I would argue further and say he really wants you to think that he is the greatest thinker of all time and has the widest encyclopedic knowledge of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
If he would
It is a very grandiose work, this
right,
book.
but if you would please just listen to him, and on that point that you make about the Disney-esque or the mythological, I wrote down hieroglyphic. So I think that the thing that the musical does so well is that it extracts out a kind of core and symbolic story with its emotional effects that serves as a symbolic hieroglyphic that anybody and everywhere, anytime can understand, can resonate. And so, yes, one of the things that struck me again about this is that there are 365 chapters in this book. And so I'm certain there was while he was very, very controlled about when it was going to be published and who could get an advanced knowledge of what it was about, you have to ask. Clearly, this is trying to imitate a book of days. The idea that there would be a sacred reading for every day of the year, and that still this is a period of time where literacy rates are increasing, but you still have a lot of communal reading going on. Somebody would be reading to groups of adults, right? And not in structured ways, just in a way. So I do think that Hugo is Charles Dickens with an awful lot more sort of traditional French encyclopedic discourses on all the reasons why, if you kind of get the Disney here, if you've already gotten the Disney, here's the next level seminar. And this is why you should embrace republicanism, and you should embrace being against the death penalty, and you should embrace universal suffrage, and follow me.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, I agree. Not just greatest novelist, but just most amazing person ever. And Victor Hugo could easily have been a cult leader if he wanted. He just decided to be a novelist. But the way he writes, it could. Well, so I will say that I think that Jean Valjean, the main character, is a cult member character, and Jean Valjean is being held up as the ideal. But if everybody behaved like Jean Valjean, you would have a cult. You would be in a cult, because Jean Valjean is completely selfless, and he does all kinds of weird things in the book. So first of all, he is extremely strong. He is like a giant with superhuman strength.
He's Samson. He's Samson.
Yeah,
I think we have
and
to acknowledge right from the outset that Hugo is one of the things that's so interesting about Hugo is that he retains his Catholicism throughout his life, kind of like Swedenborg, right? Remained a scientist. So the idea that his characters have biblical resonances, whether they're kind of Christ-like figures or they're Samson with his strength, is not. So I wanted to say that that's one of the things that I hear when I hear you talking about them. It's just so obvious. The other
yeah.
quotes.
So Jean Valjean, he never gets to have anything for himself over the course of the novel. So he gets out of prison at the beginning, and he has a transformative experience, which we'll talk about. But he ends up making a ton of money that he never gets to spend, and he ends up raising somebody else's child, and he ends up rescuing his adopted child's boyfriend, who he doesn't like, from being killed, and he releases Javert from who he thinks will be trying to arrest him once he is released. And at the end of the novel, he is nearly completely forgotten by his adopted daughter Cosette, and the young man Marius that she marries. They almost forget him, They finally remember him at the moment of his death. And one other thing about Jean is I kind of think he is like the way a narcissist would look at himself, because Jean is kind of like he is super strong, and he is like the source of all goodness in the novel, and yet he never gets to have anything for himself or be appreciated, and there's a final vindication for him at the end. And to me, that is like how a narcissist thinks, and that's kind of like what Victor Hugo might be thinking about himself, even while being like hailed as, you know, the greatest writer ever. He's saying nobody really understands me, and I never really get what I want, you know.
No, that's a really interesting point, because on the one hand, right, I think it's worth remembering that Les Mis is written at the end of his life, after he had pretty much arrived, you know, sort of in the 1840s as not only, you know, a member of the Academy and the novelist, but also the politician. And, you know, so I do think there is some kind of element, like there always is with an author, of autobiographical reflection going on in there. I do also think that uh, Hugo is maybe a good place to start if one is trying to think about Nietzsche. And I am kind of continually interested in how and where Nietzsche got some of his ideas and what he was maybe reacting to. And while, you know, the obvious place to start is with all of the Greek texts that he talks about and are all there. While you were talking about Hugo, it made me think, you know, given his popularity, given his stature, given how impactful that book was, and how much it articulated exactly a certain kind of Christianized high 19th century version of piety, right? The highest good, the
Yeah.
best good, the most morally imitatable version. You know, one wonders if Nietzsche was having exactly that kind of insight that you just articulated, that at its core, there's a degree of narcissism here, which kind of undermines the whole exercise.
And oh, and also your point about a hieroglyphic, I really like that. I thought that was great. And I had one more comparison to make that I forgot, and that is to Lord of the Rings, another book I like, because Les Miserables and Lord of the Rings are both about the turning of the age. And so they
Right.
are about great events in history that kind of change the rules a little bit.
Right.
So while in Les Miserables there's a failed revolution, there is the sense that there is a new beginning after the revolution. So Les Miserables kind of has a bunch of stuff happening in the old time, and then there is the revolution, and it's the turning of the age, and then there's quite a bit after that in the new time as well. And of course, Lord of the Rings is about the end of the third age of Middle Earth. And the last couple of chapters are in the fourth age.
No, I like that. I like that observation very much, because I think you know, that kind of description, where we have in Les Mis a very clear failure of a political and social revolution, we have a clear sort of moral, spiritual revolution on the part of the majority of the characters, right? Including Javert, who commits suicide. No, I mean, as brutal as that is a form of redemption, let's say, right? It's
Yeah.
eradicating its evil, looking upon itself and going, I cannot tolerate my impulse towards evil, right? I cannot tolerate my impulse towards, you know, policing the law when I know that the law is evil, so I'm going to do away with myself. I mean, there's and I think your point about new time, old time, and how we assess success in some kind of sense of progress, which I know we're going to make hopefully some later videos on the myth of progress and
Eventually, yeah.
time, you know, linear, eternal, and cyclical. There are some interesting meditations in here.
So, well, I'm glad you brought up Javert, because he is my favorite character, I think. And I think Javert is like he is just the weirdest character ever, because Jean Valjean is someone who is a convict. He escaped from jail, and Javert is pursuing him, and it goes over the course of like decades, where Javert is following Jean Valjean, and he loses the track sometimes. And there's this part I remember where Javert is doing like an undercover operation, and he just randomly meets Jean Valjean, and he's like Javert is like a homeless man, and there's this horrifying section where Jean sees like his face in the face of Javert in the homeless man, and he knows he's been seen, and Javert gives him this evil grin, and but it's like Jean is probably the least important criminal in the history of the French justice system, because he is sort of like somebody who stole a loaf of bread and
Right,
broke a window pane and tried to escape from jail a couple of times. So it's not
right,
like we're talking about.
which are all things that under normal circumstances are totally non-criminal. The desire and need to eat, right, and the desire and the need for freedom are,
Exactly.
I mean, they are
Yeah.
not even in any context criminal impulse.
And
It's only ownership.
and to me, like, yeah, to me, like, uh Jean ends up in jail because he steals a loaf of bread. To me, that's kind of like the Garden of Eden story. And it's like, this is just a perfect example of how Victor Hugo is like, it's so stupid that I wonder if it's genius, because it's just like he stole a loaf of bread. So like that's so silly. But then
But
on the
I
other
think,
hand, like,
but I think that it's definitely a very powerful trope in a lot of stories, right? We can go back to Aladdin. I mean, I think it goes to this very ancient kind of tension. We still have it today, no? That commerce and money and markets and so on should be privileged to the point, ownership, okay, should be privileged to the point where we would rather have others of our own species starve. So I
yeah.
think this idea that there is a penalty to be had in the name of protecting ownership, profit, and price in the face of like human starvation is and always will be very powerful um, moral presentation,
Well,
right?
it's just like how the Garden of Eden story itself, just to me, like, sometimes I'm just like, is this the dumbest story that I've ever heard? Like, but it must be great to have lasted, thousands of years, but it just
Well, I mean,
seems it seems so.
my question with it is always like, on the one hand, it's fascinating because it clearly encodes some kind of ancient memory. It is also fascinating because by starting with the question of who wrote this down and why and what got left out, okay, is very, very interesting. I mean, we talked briefly about the mythical figure Medusa, who is known to us from classical Greek mythology, where she has morphed into the Gorgon with the snake hair, who can freeze men by virtue of her ugliness. And the interesting thing is that for thousands of years previous to this, she was absolutely a goddess figure who could freeze men with her beauty. So
Yeah.
the question, and beauty and ugliness are flip sides of the same coin. Back to the point about Javert, is the flip side of our hero, right? So we can see that oftentimes what happens in a really powerful narrative is that you take a duality, you split it into two characters, and you run them around each other. No,
Yeah.
um,
So, to me, I think there is a duality, but I actually think that Jean Valjean is dual to Thénardier, the character we haven't talked about yet. But I think that you can think of Jean and Javert as being like the life impulse and death, and
oh,
and it's like,
I
and it
agree.
is so, well, it's just so funny how like the story is so ridiculous, how it's like 40 years long, and this idiot Javert keeps like pursuing Jean Valjean, but there is that real like creepiness to it. despite how stupid it is.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Sorry. I mean, I just listened to you and I'm like, well, look, 40 years, right? 40 nights and days in the desert. Okay. So
Yeah,
Javert and Jean, you know, it's Christ and the devil. The idea that the devil or fascism, which is what I think in a modern context, non-religious context, right? Javert is the force of fascism. It is the desire to follow the law regardless of how morally detestable the law is. And you know, that is the nature of perhaps what Hugo's meditation on what is the real devil, right? The real devil is the pursuit of these rules, laws, frameworks that actually run counter to what is humane, or
exactly.
natural morality, right?
Right. And Javert, like I would say that Les Miserables was a big early step on my way to becoming a libertarian because I could see that Javert is a perfect uh depiction of what the law actually is or what it's supposed to be. Because the whole idea is like you're supposed to do this no matter how stupid it is. And it's like look, the legislator approved it, so you got to do it. And ignorance is no excuse. Like
Right.
it is
So
absolutely retarded system, and Javert is a moronic retarded character who does nothing but pursue the least important criminal in French history for 40 years before finally killing himself.
right, which is where the redemption part, right? Like, or where the hopeful idealism part is, because for sure, I mean, there's, you know, this foreshadows exactly the systems of the worst kind of European fascism in the last century, or any type of fascism, right? The idea that you do it because the law says that you do it, and the law has some kind of sanction. I mean, I kind of wanting to, you know, kind of point out here that I am one exam away from finishing my law degree, and I did all of the boring stuff first. So contracts and equity and property and this and that. And the one exam I'm doing is jurisprudence, which is exactly theories of law. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in it is because since I was a child, I remember asking my mom, okay, so what do you do if you figure out that a law is unjust? Under what circumstances do you go actively break the law? Who does the law serve? How did we come to get
Oh,
it?
that's a good
Right?
one.
I mean, all
You
this kind
sound
of
like
super
quite a
duper.
precocious child there.
Well, yeah, no, she couldn't ever answer me, and bless her soul, you know, I'm trying to work that out, and part of it does derive from what your, you know, initial premise is. Where and how do we get the law? Are there kind of rights that exist in the universe, much like particles, and it's up to us to discover them, or is the law forever and eternally constructed from you know, versions of self-interest, and who knows? But it is the thing that has led me to this position that goes, you know, I'm not for anarchy. I am for the fewest number of rules that make the greatest number of sense and utilize the greatest amount of freedom for most people. And so that actually is easier to say than execute. But I do think that the question about how do we treat the laws that we have brought into existence, like, you know, corporations did not fall from the skies fully formed. We didn't mine them out of the earth. We constructed them as legal entities, and consequently, we can deconstruct them as legal entities, right? Um, Same thing with any range of thing. When it comes to human rights, you know, there's more of a question about, does it exist in the universe independent of us, or is it likewise something we can just construct and deconstruct? I don't really have the answers to my own questions, but I do know that the danger of following the law because the law is problematic if the law is something that's going to ruin the ability to play the game, or live the life.
So yeah, so to refer back to the video we just did, we have a natural law theory of poker in Bitcoin. That's what we're coming up with. And I guess we will have to close here. This is part one, and there's a lot to go, so we will do part two of Les Miserables when we have the time. And
Indeed,
I didn't even talk about the first chapter of the book where Jean Valjean has his transformation. So we'll start at the beginning of the book. We didn't quite get there yet. That's where
Right.
we'll take it up on part 2.
All 1900 pages of it. So who knows how many parts this will have, but yeah, I look forward to part 2. And as ever, thanks for talking.